Welcome to the Fidelio Podcast. I'm your host, Marie Ross, and today I'll be speaking with Russian-American writer Olga Zilberbourg. Olga is mostly a short story writer, but since getting a degree in comparative literature at San Francisco State University, she has written a wide variety of publications, including book reviews, literary essays, and translations. She worked as the senior associate editor of Narrative magazine, a job which she's recently left to devote herself full-time to writing her first novel. Olga writes in both English and Russian, and her main passion until now, her short stories, have been published in America through the Santa Monica Review, J Journal, Mad Hatter's Review, Narrative Magazine, and Prick of the Spindle, amongst other print and online publications. In Russia, she's published 2 books of collected Russian-language short stories as well. Olga is intensely thoughtful in her writing and in her life. You'll hear her talk about the fall of the Soviet Union and how it affected her as an impressionable 12-year-old, about her move to the United States at 17, completely immersing herself in a new culture, about the extraordinary events and experiences she's lived through which shape her identity and in turn shape her work as an artist. Olga is joining me today from her home in San Francisco, and if you don't mind, Olga, I'd like to start out by reading a few paragraphs from your short story, Survivors.
Sure, that sounds a little terrifying.
No, it'll be fun. It's about a group of miners that get trapped underground when a hole opens up below them. One of the miners, Ivan, has already jumped down the hole when this excerpt begins. Despite Ivan's silence, a few immediately decided to follow. There were many ways to approach the descent. One came to the hole with knees bent, arms trembling. He crossed himself 3 times before stepping onto the rope ladder. "For what sins are you punishing me, dear God?" Another said, "To hell with it all," and dove with his feet forward in the tin soldier position. Still another gulped down his vodka, lost his balance, and rolled toward the hole like a wheelbarrow. The remaining miners assembled in the corridor, whispering, waiting. "Our problem is that we don't have a leader," they said. "Ivan," they said, "he could have been our leader, the crazy bastard." It was possible, somebody suggested, that the earth got so shaken up, the rules of gravity had shifted. The hole was in fact the opening from the surface that they had been hoping for. That would explain the oxygen pouring forth from it. Leaderless, the miners split into 2 groups. One group decided to go down, and the others would remain in the shelter and wait. Members of the first group wanted to divide supplies, but the others insisted that supplies stay put. A brawl ensued, and a few people were hurled down the hole. The 2 who fought the hardest plummeted down, locked in an embrace. After they disappeared, everyone fell quiet and listened. They caught short bursts of sound that didn't make sense. Some said like firing of a semi-automatic. Others suggested popcorn cooking over fire. One miner said it was Mad Ivan laughing from the deep, but that man was clearly mad himself. They carried him to the hole and sent him flying. "Break a leg!" somebody yelled. The man laughed as he fell. There were no thuds, no splashes, no cracks, snaps, bursts, yips, or yelps. Just silence. That was an excerpt from Olga Zilberbourg's short story, Survivors.
It was lovely to hear the story in your rendition.
Thanks. So could you tell us a bit about your move to the United States and what prompted such a big decision when you were 17?
Well, it was 1996, and I come from a Jewish family, and my parents were at the time in no place to move themselves, but they were looking for some place to send me, basically. And I was just graduating from high school, and we sent out applications to several universities in England and in the United States. The school in Rochester, New York, took me without SATs based on the strength of my math background.
Wow. And what did you study in Rochester?
I instantly switched majors upon being accepted to the university. I switched from math to international business because at the time that seemed like a very promising way of making one's life in the world.
Yeah. And when did you realize that you wanted to be a writer?
That didn't happen until maybe 3 years after I graduated from college. At the time, I was living in Boston with my husband, and I suddenly realized that because I married an American man and had a job in America, I was probably going to actually stay in America. I wasn't going back to Russia.
Yeah.
I was pretty slow, I guess, to realize that, but it made me very unhappy, this thought. I had never actually pictured my adulthood in America. And so I started from writing poetry in Russian and then realized that nobody could actually read it and understand what the hell I was talking about. My friends in Russia to whom I could send that were completely outside of the context in which I was writing. So I switched to English and started looking for ways to make friends in the States who could read and comment. And
did you have pretty good English already when you came to America?
I had spent about 8 years in Russia studying English, which was good enough for my math and business classes. But when I stayed in a room with a few Americans just speaking to one another colloquially, it was as if they were speaking Martian. I really didn't understand a word of that. In part, that was because of the colloquial phrases that they used, but the very large part was that they spoke in this code of movie and TV references. Back to the Future and Star Wars. Star Wars I could recognize, I think.
Yeah.
But Star Trek, and this was a school for engineers, so a lot of sci-fi shows and I had absolutely no common reference until I made some friends who sat me down in front of the television, and that was my homework. You know, I would have to watch 2 or 3 movies a night or TV shows. And they would stop the tapes and redo the scenes by heart slowly so that I could actually figure out what was being said, and then rewind and replay those scenes so I could, so I basically, that's how I learned.
Sounds like they had a lot of fun with you.
It was fun. It was kind of like having a second childhood.
When did you move to San Francisco?
I moved to San Francisco in 2003. My husband had a job then where he could basically move anywhere and have a job. And I was thinking of trying to switch careers and find my way to writing. I guess at the time, most people do that by going to writing programs, but I felt that I hadn't read enough, and I especially hadn't read enough in English to be seriously writing on my own.
Yeah, sure.
So we moved to San Francisco, and I went to San Francisco State for a degree in comparative literature. Funny enough, because that actually was also a bit of a tangent. I studied more German and Latin American and Russian literature than I actually did of English or American literature.
And what is comparative literature exactly?
Comparative literature has a really long and interesting history that starts with Goethe, but it really took off in the States after World War II. And the idea of comparative literature is to teach students to read in other languages, not their own. So to get advanced degrees in comparative literature, one actually has to know at least 2 or 3 languages, and it used to be that you had to learn a classic language, a Greek or Latin or Hebrew, but these days most programs ask that you learn languages of different linguistic groups, so Asian languages and Arabic, in addition to Romance languages and Germanic languages. It also became the place where in the States theory lives, which is, basically European philosophy, theorists of identity and gender and post-colonial theory. So it's really a vibrant confluence of ideas. Each comparative literature class would focus on a particular theory. Like, I took some classes in feminist theory and narrative theory, and then within that, you read texts produced by different cultures. One of my most exciting papers that I produced was a comparison of Anna Akhmatova's long poem called Poem Without a Hero to Charlie Chaplin's movie Limelight. They share this character of Columbine, which is a popular commedia dell'arte character, and I traced why and how the two works approach this character. I got a lot out of that program, but it was clear that I couldn't write my own fiction and get a PhD and study literature professionally at the same time. So
yeah, that makes sense. Was being a writer a dream that you had for a long time, since childhood?
It's interesting. I think that I couldn't even conceive of writer as a profession when I was a child. All of my family members read a lot, and books were the main discussion at the dinner table. That was, what everyone talked about. And at the time I was growing up, all of a sudden, this was during the perestroika years, and the censorship laws were stricken. All of these new books were coming out, and all of my family only wanted to talk about all of these different books they were reading. And some of them I was too young to read then, but a lot of them I read at the same time as my parents did.
Part of perestroika, the political movement, part of what that did was to make banned books accessible.
Right. A lot of those books that even existed underground in this gray area, they were banned, but yet they were allowed to circulate from hand to hand. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, became published officially and came out in huge volumes, and everyone read them. And it was a very exciting time. But literature, to me, I think at the time wasn't something that was done by anyone. One had to have a mandate to be able to be a writer. One had to sort of be called by some sort of a higher power, and no such power materialized in my own life. Part of me coming to writing was very much for me a part of coming to adulthood and figuring out that was something that I wanted to do because I had things to say, and that I had to authorize myself to the position where I could say them.
You touched on this a little bit before, but you came of age in quite an interesting time. How old were you during the collapse of the Soviet Union?
The Soviet Union officially dissolved in 1991, mm-hmm. and I was 12.
You were 12, wow.
Yeah, I was just entering 6th or 7th grade. the school system had changed very rapidly. The way, as a 12-year-old, I realized change was one year when it was all Soviet kids and most Russian kids to this day start school in the fall on the 1st of September. And so one year we went to school on the 1st of September and we were all wearing our uniforms, the girls their brown dresses and the boys a formal suit. And all of us were wearing, of course, our pioneers' red ties. We came to school and we saw that half of us were wearing the uniform and half of us weren't. And then on the second day, nobody was wearing uniforms anymore. And so, things changed, and they started changing very rapidly that year because a lot of the teachers of literature, history, geography, all social sciences, they couldn't use their textbooks anymore. All of their knowledge became obsolete in the same moment that the country ceased to exist. And some of them were able to go off script, and others just weren't.
Yeah.
And as teenagers, we were all outspoken. We were so involved in watching the news every night and reading the newspapers that we knew just as well as they did the political situation. And so we caught them if something that they said no longer made sense in the current value system. We called them out on it, and we were actually pretty cruel in doing that.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
But you were quite an enthusiastic communist as a child before that, right?
Yes, absolutely. I was a great believer in everything that I learned from the kids' books that we read, and they were actually really wonderful books, and I still actually find myself rereading them once in a while to this day. For example, I remember trying to organize all of my friends to collect old magazines and newspapers for recycling, because that was what good pioneers were supposed to do. Even though at the time when we were growing up, I don't know if there were the recycling centers anymore. I think it all fell apart, even before the Soviet Union ceased to exist. A lot of the infrastructure started to fall apart long before that. I was very disappointed with my classmates who weren't quite enthusiastic about projects like that.
You were really diehard for the cause.
I really believed that peace and equality and working together for the common cause was the way to go.
Wow. So that must have been strange and maybe confusing after the sudden change of 1991.
I think at the time it was all very exciting.
Yeah, sure.
I knew very consciously actually that we were living in unprecedented historical moment. And actually I remember that I started trying to document the change in my diaries. I started trying to write about that historical moment and how exciting it was. The problem, though, with my notes from that time is that they were mostly about me and how they affected my personal life, so to speak. And that's not actually very interesting to read anymore. It was exhilarating, and I remember also trying to communicate that sense of excitement to my friends in the States later in college, and I really couldn't. And I'm still that's one of the topics that I'm still gearing up to write. I feel still that it was an unprecedented moment in history when we were growing up, feeling that we could change everything or anything that we wanted to. We actually, well, it's funny, whenever I talk about Russia, I almost automatically fall into this mode of speaking of us as a generation, of we, of my classmates and I. To an extent, I think that that's a shared feeling between, at least in my circle of friends. But ever since, well, the beginning of definitely the 21st century, I feel that it's becoming harder and harder. I see more and more differences between us now and between us then. And so a lot of my narrative of how we felt at the time is really a personal narrative. And a habit of speaking in this collective person. There was a lot of differences in the way different people of different generations accepted or couldn't accept the fall of the Soviet Union. I lived with my parents and my grandparents. We shared the apartment with, there were 3 generations in the house, and each one of us, I remember, there was a great deal of difference in how my grandparents took or spoke about the changes from my parents and from us. My grandparents were far less ready to embrace the changes as something new and revolutionary. And of course, my brother and I and some of our friends who came to the house, we felt like the whole world has been painted new.
I definitely think it's fair to say that you've fully embraced both the Russian and American cultures during your life. Do you find the two vastly different?
I do. That's a very good question. It's funny because for many years, I guess, I felt like I'm living parallel lives, that when I go back to Russia, and I've had opportunities to go back there for extended periods of time, like 3 months at a time. Mm-hmm. My Russian personality is almost parallel to my American personality, that I myself become a different person when I cross the border. I wonder actually to what extent it's true, to what extent I become a different person when I switch to a different language. It's not really been tested much by outside observers. The only people who have been able to visit me here from Russia have been my parents. My brother came twice for short visits, but none of my friends with whom I grew up have been able to make the trip yet. And when I go back to Russia, my husband sometimes accompanies me. He does observe differences, physical and emotional, but that's hard to say if that's a cultural difference or a difference because when I go to Russia, I stay with my parents in my parents' house, and I instantly become a teenager.
Yeah, like all of us.
Right.
Right. But as also somebody that at least tries to speak a foreign language, I find that even the voice changes quite a lot, right? When you speak one language or another language.
The voice changes, one's attitude changes. I've observed consciously a couple of things, that in Russia, when I enter Russia, I have to be very conscious about wiping the smile off my face, especially in any bureaucratic setting, like crossing the border. At the passport control, the officers examining my passport, I have to stop myself from smiling because Russians read that as it's a sign of a foreigner, or in a Russian, it's a sign of some kind of idiocy or mental discombobulation.
I can see that.
And the other thing that happens is that I become physically far more aggressive. My elbows go up. I move faster and in a sort of attack mode. And I'm always ready for a fight. pretty fascinating to notice. I've gotten into several very loud interactions on a bus in Russia or in the subway. One time my husband and I were on a bus and we were speaking English to each other, and a young man sitting behind us very rudely told us to shut up, basically, or leave the country if we wanted to speak English.
Mm-hmm.
And I turned around and I actually yelled at him. I yelled at him for so long and so hard that by the end of that bus ride, he skirted away from the bus, telling me that I was crazy. And
you became the crazy person.
I became the crazy person. But I was so happy because I didn't let him get away with it. I didn't let him have the last word. I basically, what I was yelling to him about was, it's a free country and we can do what we want if we're not hurting anyone. I forget what I was yelling. I can't actually remember.
That's a great picture.
Yeah.
But actually, the humor I've found was very different between the two cultures. Do you find that?
I did at first, and then I quickly learned that my Russian or Soviet humor, at the time it was definitely very Soviet humor, was not really translatable to English, or at least I at the time didn't have the means to translate it. I feel like I had to relearn trying to figure out what Americans find funny. But I wouldn't even attempt to describe the difference there.
Yeah, but I have to ask, what's an example of Soviet humor?
Well, I mean, I have a couple of jokes that nobody finds funny. I don't think they're even funny in Russia anymore. It's been too long.
Can you tell me one?
Okay. A wife is expecting her husband to come home. It's late. She's tired. She's had a full day of work. She's made dinner. He's not there. Somebody knocks on the door, and she goes to the door and she asks, who's there? There's no answer. She doesn't open the door because you never know who's behind that door. It's scary times. It's probably this joke probably dates back from the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
So she goes, back into her room, turns on the TV. There's another knock on the door, and she goes to the door and she asks, who's there? There's no answer. She gives up waiting. She goes to sleep. In the morning, she gets up, gets dressed, goes to work, opens the door, and finds her husband sleeping on the landing. Vasia, why didn't you answer when I was asking you who it was? And he says, I nodded. That's the joke. Uh-huh. Basically, the immediate implication is that, he was drunk. He was too drunk to even form an answer to her question. The reasons why it was hilarious, those are much harder to describe. And I guess now it's probably not even that funny in Russia anymore. The circumstances have changed. The reasons for drinking have changed. The engineers certainly don't get nearly that as drunk, I think, anymore. Mm-hmm. People still drink pretty heavily, but the whole culture around it changed, I think.
Thinking about these cultural differences, do you find that this affects your writing? Do you feel like you're always trying to reconcile two different worlds?
I find myself in a very odd position. A lot of what I care about and what I want to write about are now things of the past. That cultural moment of change that gave rise to a lot of my observations about the world, the moment of perestroika, I cannot write directly about it anymore, or at least I haven't found a way yet. Mm-hmm. I'm always looking for ways of writing about it in ways other than direct. Be it through magical realism, like in that story that you read from. Mm-hmm. I've been working on some science fiction stories where I basically write everything that happens in Russia and set it on Mars and instantly become science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And the other problem that I struggle with is the extent to which writing is, and in Russian in particular, it still is very much a political act. Anything that I write about Russia is going to be interpreted within a certain political context. So, for example, I visited some towns on the Volga River. I'd never had many opportunities to travel in Russia before. Growing up in St. Petersburg, we felt that it has this identity as not quite Russia. It's the most Western sort of all the Russian cities. So I've always had a lot of curiosity in traveling through Russia. This year I did that, and when I came back, I wrote an essay about it. Thinking about it afterwards, I realized that I can't publish it as an essay because I don't want to compromise anyone who appears in it. I could change the names, and I could revise it in such a way that they're not recognizable or traceable back to me anymore. But then what's the point of writing?
Yeah, sure.
Partly my fear may not be justified. You know, there are a lot of people out there saying a lot, people outspokenly criticizing the government. There are a lot of people who are doing that. I'm uncomfortable doing that because I don't live in Russia. I'm not risking anything much myself personally, but anything that I might say might put other people at risk.
Yeah.
I don't think the situation politically has deteriorated to the point where this is an actual concern, but it is a fear and a thought that I have, and because it's a conscious fear, I end up consciously censoring myself, or I'm trying to find creative ways of expressing what I need to express without the remote potential of compromising my friends and family.
You write a lot of stories in English with Russian themes, and do you find that American audiences respond well to your themes and characters that are more Russian-based?
I think there's definitely a lot of curiosity about Russia and about Russian characters. A lot of people are interested in those characters. There are certain ways of thinking about Russia that are that have become a cultural norm in the United States. I do find myself always asking myself if I'm saying something new or different and complicating the picture in some way, or am I speaking to stereotype? Am I adding to stereotype? What I find most difficult in writing about is that by virtue of working in English, I inherit certain English or American based tropes of thinking about Russia. And the language itself sort of feeds them to me. And a small example is, for instance, the use of the word babushka in English, which is used to describe both a kindly old, or not necessarily kindly, but an old Russian lady, and also a scarf, the scarf that women in Russia frequently wear, the headscarf. After a while, I found myself using this word and then stopping myself from using that, because to a Russian speaker, the first meaning, the meaning of an old woman, that can still work. The word in Russian means grandmother. Моя бабушка is my grandmother. The second meaning of the word, to mean simply scarf, is actually fairly offensive. It's like, it's literally describing an article of clothing, equating it to your grandmother. So I know that a lot of people don't see that that offensive, but I guess I'm trying to illustrate that, well, English feeds you its words, its ways of describing Russian reality, and my work in writing in English becomes this work of constant questioning whether I'm describing, where I'm speaking to what might actually happen in Russia, or the way that Russian characters might think or behave, or is it something that I'm using as a shortcut, and that I'm just relying on stereotypes.
Do you ever write in Russian about American characters and themes?
I've done that in the past, but mostly I do write in English about American characters and themes, and I enjoy doing that a lot. I'm also conscious the fact that when I write in English about English-speaking characters, in a way, when I hide my identity in the narrative, or my bilingual or bicultural identity in the narrative, I keep wondering what it adds or subtracts from the stories that I tell and that I have access to tell. I can write with some degree of veracity about, say, American college life, because I've lived it.
Yeah.
But I've never yet attempted to write about high school, because that seems an entirely alien world. But at the same time, I think that if I wanted to, I could probably do it. Part of the why I find fiction so appealing is that it's it allows you to make up all sorts of wild stories, and if you can sell them to the reader, that works. But then the question becomes, why would I want to? Why would I want to write about an American high school? And that has been, for me, a very important question. Every day one passes by a gazillion stories that, or things that could become stories, story ideas. And certain stories stick because the reasons why I have to write about this now are just better than others.
Interesting. So one thing I enjoy very much about your work is that while I think you very much have a distinctive voice, the forms, tone, and themes of your stories vary greatly. The story Survivors that I read from earlier is an absurdist and very dry style. But in other stories, you have no trouble to turn a poetic phrase. You write romance, drama, humor, and your forms can be very traditional or experimental. When you have a story in mind, how do you decide how to set it or how to form it?
That's another great question. I usually go through drafts and drafts of story beginnings. Sometimes it just happens that a story idea comes to me fully formed with a particular voice associated with it. At other times, it's something that I'm inspired in reading. A voice comes to me when I remember when I was reading Grace Paley, I couldn't read more than a paragraph at a time because every time I read a sentence or a few, I all of a sudden I had to go write a few more of my own stories. Something about her voice has such vibrancy and life and amazing ideas that it really sent my imagination in all kinds of wacky directions. The funny story about that piece, Survivors, is that piece came out of a very formal exercise. A friend of mine organized this reading. She gave us this period of structured writing time. The six of us gathered around the table, and we each wrote a word on a piece of paper, and then we dropped these words into a hat. And we went around the table, and once one of us picked out a word, the timer was set, and we had, I think, at first 3 minutes to write the beginning of the story based on that first word. And then the second person would pick out the second word from the hat, and we had a little bit more time, say 5 minutes, to continue the story with that word. And the other constraint was that the words had to be used in the story in order in which they had been pulled out of the hat.
Okay.
It sounds incredibly dry and, I don't know, intellectual, but what ended up happening for me is, I think the first word was descent.
Okay.
And it allowed me to free associate to something I hadn't thought of before, or to a world that I hadn't thought of in a long time. It allowed me to access some part of my brain and some part of my memories that I didn't even know existed anymore at that point.
Wow.
From that first word, I created that world of the miners, and then each next word allowed me to. The constraint of it actually helped me. It was something to work against and to shape my story based on these memories that started popping up. And I didn't have time to worry about the voice or dialogue then. We were allowed to revise these stories. So some of the individual characters, like that Ivan, I think appeared in later revisions. But the idea of it and the central image appeared from this very formal exercise.
I wanted to ask you, too, about Where the Sea Flows. There was a movie made a couple years ago in 2011, a short film, and it was actually the first Russian film to be shown at the Manhattan Short Film Festival. And it's a film based on a short story of yours. Could you tell us a bit about this film and the experience you had with it?
Yeah, that was a really fascinating experience. The story is one of the few stories that I have that I wrote in Russian, and it only exists in Russian. I never translated it to English for various reasons. I wasn't sure that it would even work as a story in English. It's basically two very short scenes, two scenes between a mother and a daughter, in which the relationship between the two is reversed, and the daughter actually mothers the mother. When I met the young man, Vitaly Saltykov, he had worked on television before, and he's a family friend.
He's the director of the film, right?
He's the director of the film. He had read my second book of short stories that came out in Russia at that time. He was instantly interested in that story. He had done a lot of work with orphans in Russia, and he has some really fascinating projects going on. He's an actor and a performer, a musician. He's a very talented man. The story appealed to him. That character, that little girl, I think, appealed to him for her independence and self-resilience. When he started trying to create a script based on that story, he asked me, well, but why is their relationship in this shape? What happened? Why is this mother refusing or unable to be a mother, and and how come the daughter has to play both parts? And I didn't have an answer for that. That's not where the story was for me.
Yeah.
When I wrote it, and this is probably why I never translated it to English, or at least the two things are related. I didn't want to look for that explanation, but he felt that for him to make a film from that story, that was a key piece of information that he needed to have. And anyway, I couldn't help him, so he ended up writing the... he asked me if I wanted to participate in writing the screenplay, but I had to say couldn't, and he did it, and he did it very well, and it's a completely independent work of art. It's the two scenes that exist in my story are reproduced very clearly in that film, and there's a scene where the second scene shows the mother and the daughter being at a lake, and it's
Yeah, I was reading, actually. I read something that I thought was fantastic from him. He said one scene in particular where the mother and daughter stand on the shore really stuck with me, talking about reading your story. And he said, I keep seeing it in my head until finally I put it on film.
And that's exactly, that's exactly where the story began for me, and that's the scene that ended up being the most amazing thing, to see that scene done on film, and it was done in almost exact. It almost exactly came out of the way I had pictured it, and that was sort of fantastic to see.
Wow.
And I have to say that both of the actors, both the woman who plays the mother and the girl, the little girl, are fantastic. The actress is actually fairly well known in Russia. He wrote the part for her, I think. But the way the little girl took ownership of that character, I'm really awed by her work.
Is there going to be any way that we can see it with subtitles?
The movie was shown at the festival, or during the festival, and it exists with subtitles. I don't know what the opportunities for showing short movies are out there. Maybe eventually Vitaly will decide to put the whole thing on YouTube. Oh, I did. I think both I and my husband participated in writing the subtitles.
Oh, really?
Or writing and editing the subtitles. So the subtitles are pretty faithful. I hope eventually it will be available on the internet. But I imagine that for now, I think I don't know if he's still showing it on festivals, but he was up until last year, I know.
Yeah, I think it's going to be in Germany soon. I think I saw that online. But,
that's great. Yeah, I've been a little bit out of touch, I guess. I've been working too much.
Yeah, you have to keep us informed about that, or if you ever decide to translate the story too. I would love to read it. It sounds great.
Yeah, that'll be a fun. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know about translating the story, but it would be great to share the film.
Yeah. So what are some of your favorite books? Or can you tell us which books you're reading now?
I've been, for the last, I don't know, 3 to 5 years, depending on how you count, I had been working for a literary magazine as an editor. And so I had been reading a lot of contemporary prose. On the side, I just participated in a couple of book groups that allowed me to keep my reading a little bit wider in terms of time and language. So I've been participating in this one particular book group that reads, we read books reprinted by New York Review of Books, and they publish a lot of translated novels and books that have gone out of print for various reasons. Many of these books have been very, very inspiring. So one book, well, 2 books, they've reprinted two books by Tove Jansson. Do you know her? She's known, I think, in Europe very well as the author of the Moomin Troll comic books.
Yeah,
books
I've
for
heard
kids.
the name.
Somewhere in Sweden, I think they even have a theme park dedicated to the Moomin trolls. These books, the books for kids, were very popular in Russia too when I was growing up. But I never read them then. All of my friends were talking them up, but for some reason I never got into them. But adult books or books for adults. One of them is called Fair Play, and the other is called The Summer Book. Fair Play basically it's very close to her biography, and it's basically a book about how to be a consummate artist into your old age as a woman. And she lived she lived for many years with her partner was an artist. The way she describes their relationship is so fascinating and so odd. She describes the two of them living in the opposite sides of this apartment. When they get together is almost, it feels like, and maybe I'm making this up already, it's been a few months since I read that book, but it's almost like they make appointments with one another to see a movie together every night or every other night. But their lives, and they're two women, their lives are completely devoted to their art, to their individual art forms. And then their relationship and everything else is built around that. Anyway, I find it very charming, a little scary, intimidating.
Yeah.
But also oddly inspiring.
Cool. So you're going to move on from your editing job and doing a lot of editing work to planning your own novel.
Yes. I've been working on this novel idea for a year, and it's interesting. I feel like almost all short story writers experience this pressure where it starts with people asking you, are you writing a novel, or when are you going to write a novel? And complementary to that, I think the more I write, the longer and the more complicated my stories grow naturally. I started from writing, and you might remember this, I started from writing these one-page stories that didn't really go anywhere.
Yeah.
And over time, they were growing bit by bit. The 3-page story, 6-page story, I have now a couple of 30-page stories, which are way too long to be stories. My novel project is sort of somewhere in between. I approach it sort of as an idea of dissertation. So I've been learning lots of things about craft and how one approaches storytelling. And I have this great idea of a time and place and fascinating characters. The time is 1910, or 1912 actually, Germany, Marburg, a very popular place for Russians, and particularly Russian Jews, to go to study at the time. There was a fantastic philosophy department there, and the man in charge, Professor Hermann Cohen, was perceived as one of the best philosophers, the most exciting philosophers of his age, and he was a German Jew, so he was friendly to the Jewish cause of education. Jews could not easily receive a graduate degree in Russia at the time, so they were looking outside of Russia for it. Anyway, so that's it's a fascinating time and setting, and I have a particular character, actually a family that I'm tracing within that setting, and I'm also trying to write it as sort of as a thriller adventure novel.
Wow.
So I'm I'm entertaining myself with it. I'm trying to keep it interesting on several different levels at once, and surprising myself. I'm trying to approach it as I would a dissertation, which means I'm doing my research, and then at some point next year I'm going to have to start putting out 1 chapter a week.
Yeah, wow. That sounds like a good plan.
Yeah, it sounds a little ambitious, but where would we be without those kinds of ambitions? Huh?
Exactly. Beautiful. I hope you enjoyed listening to my chat with Olga Zilberbourg. I'm always excited to see what Olga is writing because of all the different forms she uses, and also simply because her short stories, like a lot of short stories, show us a very small slice of a picture. Olga deals in images. She can create a mood and a character, or part of a character, with a bit of dialogue, and that's the beauty of her stories. That's what she hands to us readers. Her characters sometimes don't have a past or a future, but they exist in the moment that she creates for them. This is why it made perfect sense to me to hear her talk about how she couldn't create anything more for her characters for the film Where the Sea Flows. Her creation existed as it was conceived, as a short story. But I also understand the filmmaker, as probably all of us can, wanting more. Because written images, especially powerful or poetic ones, can be addictive. Olga has written so many stories that I'd like to talk about, but in one called What Goes Around, she describes the relatively ordinary event of a middle-aged woman coming to the door to ask for money. The interesting part of the story is not the event itself, but the memories that start to become triggered in the main character. And it's after the event, how it keeps popping back into her mind, and how it eventually starts to shake her relationships with her present world and the friends that surround her in her new life in a different country. These are the sort of stories that make you think, and these are the kinds of images that are likely to stick in your head for some time. You can visit Olga's website at www.zilberbourg.com. That's zilberbourg.com. And there you can read a selection of her stories, you can see a list of her publications, or click over to her blog for a bit of fun, or you can get in contact with her. And to get in contact with the Fidelio Podcast, you can visit our Facebook page, or visit our website through my website at marieross.info. This has been the Fidelio Podcast.